Webinar will be presented by Dr. Adam Cooper and Professor Azim Badruddin. I'm really happy to welcome both these colleagues. The topic of the webinar is Markets on the Margins, TVET, Covert and the Informal Economy in South Africa. So a very interesting topic and we look forward to hearing about it. Just some housekeeping. The webinar will be recorded, and so we hope that everybody's okay with that. Please keep yourself muted until the end, but please use your chat to make comments, post questions, and engage, and you can do that during the presentation. To let you know, you'll see that the numbers are slightly less today. And one reason for that, probably a big reason for that, is that our students have been excused as they are writing exams, so they won't be attending. This webinar, and they might not attend the next one either. This is our penultimate webinar in this series, and so thanks to Colette Tennyson for functioning as scribe. She has this really difficult job of trying to pull the themes out of these very rich discussions that have taken place over the last few webinars. So thank you very much, Colette. Francis will, in the beginning of January, put a meeting together of the working group, who are the partners who pulled this webinar series together, so that we can discuss the way forward. And I'll brief you a little bit more at the end of the last webinar on the 6th of December. For now, it's my privilege to introduce our two speakers. So Dr. Adam Cooper is a senior research specialist in the education and livelihoods theme of the Inclusive Economic Development Program of the HSRC. His current interests include youth and the future of work on the African continent. He's just published, well, not just published, about a year ago, published a really excellent book, and I'd suggest you read it, which engages with youth experiences. Prof. Azim Badruddin is the Deputy Director of the School of Education at the University of Cape Town, and an old friend and colleague, so welcome Azim and welcome Adam. The format that we'll use today is that we will, Adam will speak first. So Adam, I'm going to give you maybe 30 minutes, give or take. And then Azim will respond, maybe 15 minutes. Azim has to leave for mosque by 10 to 1. So we're going to try and move this along because we've lost a little bit of time at the beginning. So just to welcome all the colleagues, our international colleagues, our national colleagues, and I see many colleagues from different disciplinary spaces online, which is really fantastic that we're beginning to pull together across disciplines or transdisciplinary, if you like. In this session, Adam is going to reflect on co-editing two publications, the Oxford Handbook of Global South Youth Studies and a special issue of Social Dynamics on Young People and Work. So Adam, rather than waste any more time, because I'm worried about Azim's timetable, can I hand over to you at this point?
Sure, thank you, Leslie. Just going to share my screen. There's a little bit of an echo reverberating back at me. That's better. Yeah, so thanks, Leslie. Maybe I'll just start by reflecting or saying how I'm located in all of this, because it shapes what I'm going to say. And yeah, so we're now a program at the HSRC called Inclusive Economic Development, which was an amalgamation of the Education and Skills Group and the Economic Performance and Development Group into one super program. My background is sort of in the education, sociology of education and sociology of youth. So I'm coming at this issue from that kind of perspective and trying to apply some of these ideas to the TVET space and what they might mean in our current context, being both the global pandemic context as well as a kind of prior to that set of conditions around work that I will speak to. You'll see that the title is slightly different to what I'd originally said, Markets on the Margin. and I'm not sure I'm completely that this new title is exactly what I want to say, but what I would like to do today essentially is to question some ideas around the notion of work. And there's been quite a lot said about work, the world of work in this series. And yeah, so I'd like to ask some questions and probe a bit more around what it might mean going forward in contexts like South Africa. I've also tried, you'll see there's an image in the background, which on my screen is being blotted out by my own face. I've tried in the presentation to include artwork from various young South Africans. This is Blessing Ngubeni, who's the Standard Bank Young Artist of the Year. This image on the title cover, it's actually about leadership in Africa and South Africa. I think it depicts the condition of young people and their search for work as well. It's an interesting set of overlaps there. So I can't, there we go. So I'd like to just start by sharing one of my favorite articles and quotes from a lot that's been said about the pandemic, the Covert Pandemic. And it's from Arundhati Roy, who I think was the first novelist that I really made me want to read novels by choice rather than being forced to do so through various courses. But she says, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and excuse me, prejudices and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And I've chosen that quote because I think that it speaks to some of the ideas we have around work, particularly the notion of a job and what it means, that for quite a while now has, and I will speak to it more directly in this next slide with another quote, been not really able to describe the context, particularly context of the global South, places that were colonized, places on the African continent, Latin America, and Asia. So James Ferguson, who's an author I read quite a lot, an anthropologist, has written a paper with Tanya Lee called Beyond the Proper Job, Political Economic Analysis After the Century of Laboring Man. And I think that this quote speaks to some of those old ideas that Arundhati Roy is asking us to leave behind. They say the 20th century in retrospect now appears as the century of laboring man, the lifeway of a small fraction of the population, the stabilized urban working class, became quite suddenly and somehow for many quite convincingly projected as the future for all. Stable waged and salaried labor is not disappearing in any absolute sense, but it's losing its plausibility as the universal solution. So I think it's important there to also note that Ferguson and Lee are not saying that there's going to be no more salaried waged labor, but it's certainly not going to be the way that the majority of the populations of the world create livelihoods for themselves and make a living. And I'll demonstrate that in a minute. So to carry on quite specifically, the talk that I'm going to give today is not based on any one paper or article that I've written, but it comes out of a range of pieces that I've been involved with in the last few years. The two in particular that I have on the screen there are going to be published next year in 2021. One is a handbook of Global South Youth Studies. Oxford University Press wait until they've seen the full manuscript before calling it the Oxford Handbook of Global South Youth Studies, which they've now done, but they reserve the right not to do so. So that's coming out next year. And then in a special issue of the journal Social Dynamics, which has 6 very deep ethnographic studies of young people's searches for employment, their innovations around creating livelihoods for themselves. And I think it provides quite a rich picture of sort of the conditions on the ground. So those are the sort of pieces that are forming the basis of my talk. And I'd like to engage with 4 questions, the TVET one coming last because it's the one that I feel least confident making comments about. But I'd like to think about what I've called their improvisation in adversity. How do young South Africans make a living? And firstly, I'll explore some concepts. I've already knocked the concept of jobs or salaried work, but I think that concepts are important to how we think about these issues. So thinking about a range of different concepts: work, employment, income generation, livelihoods. I'd then like to see what young people's practices on the ground tell us about these concepts. And then an area that I think is often quite overlooked, the issue of geography, cities, townships, rural areas, how they shape income generation, employment, livelihoods for young people. And then at the end, I'll offer a few thoughts on how I see this as affecting technical and vocational education, and Zim will add a few more. So to start with the issue of concept, which I've already used a quote from Ferguson and Lee, to go back to their paper on Beyond the Proper Job, they point out quite clearly that there's been a failure of transition narratives, that there's this belief that there'll be a universal trajectory from farm-based and traditional livelihoods into the proper jobs of a modern industrial society. And economic progress stories promise this universalization of waged or salaried employment, when in fact the situation on the ground is very different. As I said, I'll demonstrate that in a minute. But one kind of way of thinking about how the concept of the proper job might not be useful is to think about this issue of formality and informality, which formed the previous title of this talk. And so I'll engage a bit with what we mean by the informal employment, informal sector, informal enterprises. You have definitions on the screen there, and then speak a little bit about why this might not be the most useful way of thinking about these issues. So informal employment speaks to all employment not characterized by formalized employment contracts, conditions, and benefits, enterprises that are paid and unpaid in all economic sectors, with employees not necessarily or not paying taxes. So that's sort of a very broad and general understanding of informality as it relates to these concepts of employment, informal sector, and informal enterprises. And when institutions like the ILO try and describe how those sorts of livelihood generating activities look across the world, I think this graph is quite telling, these two graphs. So to explain them a little bit, the one on the left-hand side looks at the percentage of formal employment in total employment by age. So to take the graph on the left-hand side, if you look at youth of 15 to 24 years, the green line on the African continent shows that between 0 and 10% of young people at that age have formal employment as an amount in relation to total employment. So if 5% have formal employment, 95% have informal employment. You see it rises slightly as people get older, but it doesn't rise significantly. You'll see in the graph and the picture is quite similar for places like Africa, Latin America, and Asia. When you look at the developed world, and I don't really like the terms developing and developed, but we could call them global north and global south. If we look at the global north, Europe and North America, for example, you'll see that far in excess of 70–80% of people, including young people, are getting work in formal positions. So we see that, and I don't really want to use the word labor markets either, but let me use it for now. Labor markets are quite different in different parts of the world, and making sense of that is no easy job. A slight caveat, an important caveat, is that South Africa is slightly different. The informal sector is smaller, and there are a number of reasons for that. In various analyses, sort of coming out at about 20% of total GDP. Part of this is apartheid history and spaces being regulated in the townships, not allowing informal enterprises to blossom and bloom. Another structure of our economy issue is that there are a few conglomerates that dominate each sector. I'll speak about my own paper on the township tourism economy, and you'll see that in the tourism sector, 6 or 7 companies dominate sort of 90% of the business that's being done in those, which makes it difficult for informal businesses to grow. I did want to say that even if the informal sector is smaller in South Africa, the human economy, the way that money changes hands and the way that grants, for example, compensate for the market is very strong in terms of social relations and how they function to enable livelihoods to be produced. So just because informal economies are not as big in the South African context, that doesn't necessarily mean that the market is the only way that, and the capitalist economy is the only way that people are making a living. And to then, my hesitancy to the notion of the labor market is the slide doesn't completely fit with my whole presentation, but I like it. I didn't erase it, but it does show that that a kind of the unsocial analysis of supply and demand in labor markets doesn't give us a full picture of what's going on with young people and work in South Africa. So as you see on the left-hand side, that graph shows us that unemployment rate by education level and age, for whatever level of education, age is more important in determining employment than education. So 15 to 24-year-old graduates from university are 31% unemployment versus 18%, less than matric, 23% of 35 to 64-year-olds. On the right-hand side, you see there that white people with a matric have a lower unemployment rate than Black African South Africans with tertiary education. So what I'm trying to do in these two graphs is to say that the social factors that shape employment, if we're going to look at this through the lens of employment, are very important mediators, you could say, of the labor market, and they have vast repercussions for which kinds of young people are able to access livelihoods in that way. Having said that, I proposed informality as a way of making sense of livelihood generation in our context. At the same time, I'd like to say that this formal and informal binary is problematic for a number of reasons. People who studied informality see that it's actually a continuum, that many organizations have some activities that are carried out formally while others are done informally. The relationship between the formal and informal sectors is not clear. And informality is defined by what it is not, much like the ILO using the term non-standard work. Informality doesn't really tell us what these activities are. All it tells us is that they're not formal. ILO concepts like non-standard work, when most of the world is now doing non-standard work, doesn't really tell us what they are doing. So the formal informal division doesn't really help us to understand these issues of how young people are generating livelihoods. So I'd like to turn briefly to how studies from the ground up, more ethnographic studies of what young people are actually doing might give us some insights into these concepts that I've tried to problematize. Let me just have a sip of water because I'm talking quite fast. So one idea that a number of people have explored is this notion of mixed livelihoods, diverse income streams, or hustling as better than formal and informal. And a number of people have alluded to the fact that many or most young people, by far the majority of young people in urban areas, particularly in Africa, are making a living through mixtures of activities. Andries du Toit says that this could include agrarian production, reciprocal exchange, informal employment, and social grants, both in urban and rural areas. In various Cape Town townships, this is sometimes called skarrel, and James Ferguson speaks about distributed livelihoods and has a list there of activities that might form distributed livelihood: petty trade, hustling, casual labor, smuggling, begging, theft, making up as a differentiated whole a better picture into how people are making a living. Tatiana Tim, who studied the informal economy of recycling in Nairobi, explores this notion through her concept of the hustle, which she says is a general condition of contemporary urbanism, in that it describes generative possibilities that emerge from everyday experiences of uncertainty associated with life work outside of the bounds of normative social institutions. And I think that that's quite important because in parts of the global south, these social institutions and social protections that might both encourage people to go into the labor market and in exchange for certain benefits from the state don't necessarily exist, and that the supports that come in general in these places in the northern hemisphere often are absent in our context in South Africa and places like it. So I will speak a bit. Let me just summarize here. So busting this myth of the proper job and looking at various places across the global south, we see a range of concepts and ideas that speak to this notion of differentiated livelihoods, often dominated by forms of waiting. Alcindor Honwana's book on waithood in Africa, hustling, being on standby in the Philippines, that a colleague, Clarence Baton, has used in that context, and it relates to notions of underemployment in parts of Asia. There's an excellent book by Jeffrey called Degrees Without Freedom, and how young Indians with educational qualifications are not necessarily able to access work. So I've explored these ideas of mixed livelihoods, or people that have been contributing to the special issue of Social Dynamics with me, have explored this notion of distributed livelihoods through a range of papers, and I'll speak to three of them. One is my own, and two are from Chris Webb and Hannah Dawson. Both of these papers are their PhDs. Chris Webb explored young people in Khayelitsha's search for jobs. And I think what's interesting about both Chris Webb and Hannah Dawson's research is that they find that young people often are able to access jobs. So we had a quite provocative seminar last year about, do young people want jobs? And the answer is certainly yes, but the answer is also it depends. It depends on the kinds of jobs on offer. And many, if not most, young people have had opportunities to work as supermarket packers, petrol attendants, security guards, experiencing these forms of employment as racist, exploitative, with little potential for upward social mobility. And I think that's the key point, is that young people are interested in jobs as such, if it has potential for better jobs in the future. When it doesn't, the experiences they have in these jobs often result in them leaving the labor market and becoming what survey research calls discouraged job seekers. So the kind of appeal around low wage or leaving low wage work in a lot of this ethnographic research is that people have control over income generation in relation to time. They don't have to take a lot of the sort of racial abuse, which often comes from having a white boss overseeing you on the construction site. And that people want this kind of freedom, and low wage labor doesn't necessarily give it. So a lot of these experiences found that young people have worked, but that they choose not to unless the conditions change. And then there's some very interesting examples of how young people do make opportunities for livelihoods for themselves. Hannah Dawson has a fascinating study of a car wash in Zandspruit, and the different social and economic relationships that contribute to forms of work at the car wash, how young people space, particularly being positioned in particular spaces in relation to taxi ranks, connections with local mechanics, informal enterprises, how these forms of entrepreneurship work in informal settings, and how they sort of transcend social and economic relations. And in Chris Webb's paper, he says that rather than this kind of exhausting attempt to make the numbers go down, the numbers of unemployment go down so that we feel better, we need to look at what young people are already doing out there in the world and support that. And I'll speak a little bit in a minute about it not necessarily needing to be an either or, but I think that looking at that while the unemployment rates of young people might be high, they're certainly not doing nothing. And a lot of the time, the things that they choose to do are indicative of the kinds of livelihoods that with a bit of support would most likely get some traction. So I'll speak to that a bit in a minute. My own study in the social dynamic special issue looks at young Black township, well, not only township, tourism entrepreneurs in both townships as well as the inner city of Johannesburg. And so things like a young man who's taken now 900,000 people up Ponte Tower and now runs sort of team building exercises there, a migrant hostel in Tembisa, and bicycle tours of Alexandra. And in doing this ethnographic research with about 10 young people, following how they create and make their businesses, my sort of way of making sense of it was looking at how they draw on both stories, practices, historical artifacts, and buildings in marginalized spaces that they know well. They have a kind of competitive advantage because they grew up in these spaces, but they also have resources from formal education, schooling, English language, relationships with privileged others, and that their strategies for making these businesses work involve what I've called their subfields with different rules of the game, and using the logics and rules from formal economic and educational spaces and applying them to the informal economy, such that they can satisfy tourists who want what the young people describe as raw or authentic experiences of life in inner city Johannesburg or in the township, places where they grew up and are very familiar with. They're able to use the language of tourism and their knowledge of what a business should be doing in these informal spaces. And I make reference to this because I think that a lot of the policy ideas are to formalize informal spaces. And in speaking to young people about that as a solution, it would essentially take away their business, because if this now becomes an official township tour, the kinds of people who go on their tours would find it less appealing because it's kind of sanitized. So the paper's called Dancing on the Ceiling because these young people are using kind of innovative practices from various spaces across the post-apartheid city, but they're not able to rise too high. They're dancing on the ceiling because of their access to capital, because of these conglomerates in the tourism sector who dominate at shows, at big hotels and so on. And so, yeah, let me leave it at that. Just looking at the time as I'm expecting a word from Leslie in a minute. So what does all of this mean for TVET in my opinion? And so I'd like to say two things. Maybe let me start with some of the examples of ideas from other parts of the world that I think might be quite useful, not only other parts of the world, our own context as well, in South Africa that is. And I came across recently a fascinating book called The Informal Economy in Developing Nations, which Erica Kramer-Mbula, who's at UJ, has co-edited. And this table comes from her chapter in that book, and speaks to some of these ideas on knowledge that we've also been engaging with. So I find this table really interesting. Professor Kramer-Mbula looked at the sources of knowledge that people who are manufacturing home and personal care products and selling them informally, where do they get their knowledge to do this? And you see a wide range of quite evenly split places, sources of knowledge, main sources of knowledge. So each of those, I think nearly 150 people were only allowed to name one. But you see from quite formal, and I asked Leslie yesterday if she knows what technology transfer agencies are. Apparently, from what I can tell in this chapter, they're based in places like TUT and UWC in Cape Town, where people can access formal knowledge that would help them in their particular industry. But I'd love to learn more about it. But you'll see there, what's interesting to me is that people mix and match, much like the distributed livelihoods I've been speaking about, sources of knowledge from various places. I'll speak in a minute what I understand that to mean. In looking at, and I'd hoped that Matthias Pils could have actually spoken today. There's been a bunch of coordination issues, but looking at the work that he's participated in India and the kinds of support for informal sector traders in India, again, we see a kind of tailored solution to both formal and informal learning sorts, which he speaks about the kind of power of informal apprenticeships through family businesses and informal businesses, but also some of the shortcomings, the quality of skills, the business models that are developed in those, and how a kind of tailored solution that links both formal and informal opportunities and support might be tailored for street vendors, most importantly in the places where they're working, so that it would be not massive treks across town and large amounts of resources invested, but that NGOs could actually meet quite literally people where they're at in terms of the work that they're doing. Okay, so I've tried to put the word "and" in that final slide as big as I can in thinking from my very limited experience with the TVET sector of what this might mean, these kinds of mixed livelihood range of places people are working on the ground. I suppose I'm saying that a kind of centralized state planned industrial development approach with TVET courses accompanying it cannot be the only way that we help generate livelihoods for people on the ground. And part of the reason for this is that I feel in a democratic developmental state, as I've got in the heading there isn't the kind of centralized authority to do so at the pace at which things are moving. So it reminds me a little bit of us trying to publish on this thing called 4IR, and by the time publication is ready, the state of play has kind of changed. And I think that the way that people are generating livelihoods in ways that are in flux makes it very difficult to, and I work for a state organization at the HSRC, which is very unnimble and hard to make responsive to what's actually happening on the ground. I think that, and I'd like to say that "and" is there, that can be used for certain things, but they also have to be locally responsive support mechanisms for livelihood generation. And I've given some ideas today about how we might begin to start thinking about that. I had one more slide.
Adam, I'm really worried that Azim needs to leave in 10 minutes.
Yes.
So I'm wondering if we can
stop. I'm finished.
Yes, or I've got another suggestion. I'm wondering if we can let Azim speak, and then Azim has to leave us, and then you can come back in and just kind of finish and maybe just pull it all together, because I think you've got things to say that are quite useful for pulling it together. Can we do that? Okay,
Sure.
So colleagues, I'm not going to take comments or questions and so on now, just to accommodate Azim's diary, because he has to leave at 10 to get to mosque. So Azim, can I hand over to you at this point, please?
Yeah, thanks, Leslie. I think that's a good suggestion, because I do think Adam, this will fit into what Adam he wants to say on the following few slides. Look, I feel a bit, I must admit, like an imposter, a person that has not really worked in this area for the past couple of years, that has re-entered the field recently and is currently working on dropout and retention in colleges for the big TVET project. But ironically, when I decided when I agreed with Adam to comment here, we were meant to have completed the project by now. And obviously with COVID, we haven't done a thing. So let me give some comments on where Adam is going on this. Look, a long time ago, when I started working on colleges, let's call them colleges because they have different titles at different times. A long time when I started working on this, the one thing that challenged me was that colleges didn't seem to offer a possible solution to the problems that we have in South Africa with regard to both knowledge, people getting access to knowledge, people getting access to ways of knowing that allow them to find sustainable work, and to getting employed in viable ways. So there's always been this challenge for me, and it's been racialized, obviously. We all know the story that if the majority of the African population is going to colleges and entering at the bottom, they will never rise to the top. And so essentially you're supporting a system that is always going to be racialized. So we always have been fighting for inverting that. But the one challenge through all of that has always been this thing about that if you don't, then you're not going to get people out of poverty. And so there's this close thing, this close relationship between formal and informal education and poverty and the livelihoods of our larger communities. And at what point do we give up on the ideal of equalization and simply focus on getting them into jobs and getting them into some kind of sustainable living that lifts them out of the challenges that they face on a daily basis. And I think that's the dilemma that the sector faces all the time. How do you change, how do you switch that scenario that Adam spoke about 5% of the marginalized communities of Africa being formally employed as opposed to 95 that are not? Is informal employment the way to go? And if it is the way to go, how do you give people access to knowledge forms that allow them to work in those sectors and manage those sectors in ways that grow and don't collapse overnight? Ironically, in South Africa, if I look at Leslie's work and a few other people's work across the country, ironically, it's more possible to enter the informal labor market in the rural areas and in more poverty-stricken areas than it actually is in the more formal areas like Cape Town, Johannesburg, and the cities where the conglomerates or the formal industries squeeze the possibilities of earning what I would call what people see as not only meaningful work but legal work. You can in the informal sector earn money in the cities, but inevitably it's seen as it's inevitably criminalized. So how do you then access? How do you then develop a infrastructure to deal with these kinds of scenarios? And for me, that's the big challenge that comes out of Adam's presentation, which I must say, Adam, I really enjoyed following your different ideas, working through the different papers that you've written. How do you imagine a world anew and an institutional and policy portal that we all need to enter then pass through? To what's this when Anundrati Roy speaks about the portal, this little luggage. What's the little luggage and the little baggage that she speaks about? Can people afford to take little luggage through that portal to get to the other side? Can our learners take the little knowledge that they're getting to be able to find spaces to work and make their lives viable in terms of employment? And how much baggage do they need to let go of in order to get there? And I think those are the key challenges that tease into this idea of work, employment, income generation, and livelihoods. Because the problem with imagination is that to imagine, you have to foresee and identify a possible future, and you have to be able to plan towards it. In an environment where you can't, then it's very hard to imagine. So whatever we speak about then in relation to imagining, it's very almost rhetorical and flimsy, whereas the idea of the imagined community was always meant to be far more structured and far more viable, as in the words of Anderson. Maybe I don't want to do too much more than that, Adam, and allow you to pull through. But the one thing I did want to say is that the human economy is strong. People have the ability to find work. But how they find work and how we empower them with forms of knowledge that make that work sustainable over time is where the big challenges lie. And again, it's whether it's in informal employment. We've been speaking about this for 20 years. It's not happened. We've developed the infrastructure, schools of skills, a new three-stream system that hasn't even begun to find its legs yet. We've speaking about these things for 20 years and nothing's really happened substantially yet. And so my challenge is, if we hold on to this notion of informal education, yes, it can change the way in which people live on a daily basis. But my question is it a way forward in terms of what the system is allowing? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Azim, and for such a wonderful feedback and response to Adam's presentation. What I'd like to do now is to allow Adam the opportunity to finish his last few slides, which talks to his interpretation of what this might mean for TVET. And also on behalf of all of us here, the colleagues, just to say bye-bye to you, Azim, because I know you're excusing yourself early, and look, have a good Christmas and so on if we don't get to speak to each other before then. Okay, Adam, I'm going to hand back to you.
Thanks, Leslie. I mean, I don't think I had too much more to say, and I'd really like to give people a chance to engage with some of these ideas. I think I went through quite a lot in quite a short period of time. I felt like I was rushing, but that's also just kind of sometimes the way things happen when I do presentations. So just to sort of, I think what I've tried to do what I have tried to say, and I heard Azim kind of also grappling with it a bit, and yeah, is that I think it's most important that it doesn't necessarily. There's a lot of, as an outsider in this, if I can call it a sector, I also feel like a bit of an imposter. There's a lot of either ors. There's a lot of binaries, as people might critique in academic spaces, and I don't think it has to be an either or. I don't think it has to be either powerful knowledge or experiential knowledge. I don't think it has to be either formal or informal, employment or unemployment. And I don't think, if we look, and that's partly the reason for looking at what's happening on the ground, is that I think that on the ground it never is. So the question is, how do you do both? How do you do both? And it's never. And Azim is right. Sort of the informal economy. I hope I haven't sort of glorified it in some way as a wonderful space where young people hustle and are creative. You know, it's a hard space, and it's a space with its own hierarchies and ways of meting out justice. So I really don't think it's ever going to be an either or. But I think that in front of our eyes, work is being remade as we speak. And so it's about thinking about solutions that can be both kind of centralized through a developmental state, a democratic development state. Remembering we're not, you know, I lived in China for a year. You know, if you want to move 3 million people to build a hydroelectric dam, you just do it. It's unless you have shared some of these ideas with my partner this morning, who has worked much more extensively in TVET than I have. And she said, you need a command council like we have for COVID. You just need to make a command council and they'll kind of direct things. And as desirable as that is, I think it is also about creating structures of governance that are going to enable both a kind of centralized planning mechanism as well as supporting people where they're at. And I think that speaks to both incorporating different kinds of knowledge, different spaces in which these activities happen, as well as different economic and educational sectors. And I'll stop there, Leslie. Thank you all.
Thank you so much, Adam, for this extremely powerful presentation. It really pushes us to consider which of the ideas that we've been dragging along in the TVET sector really are just dead ideas and ideas we need to be letting go of. And I know for many of us, we have concerns with HCT, human capital theory, for example, which is one of the ideas that we've been dragging along for quite a while, and there are possibly others. I'm going to open the floor in a minute, but I'd like to just add to Azim's commentary on your presentation, if that's okay. And I think your presentation has really zoomed into this tension between these kind of cognitive and developmental purposes of education, and on the other hand, the social justice and ethical purpose. And for a long time in South Africa, one of the ideas that we had were that these two ideas are somewhat perhaps distinctive ideas. So we've been coming at this in different communities and in different, the host wants me to do something. Tabu? Okay, you want me to start my video. I think we've been coming at these debates almost as if they are distinctive debates, but perhaps one of the dead ideas that we need to be letting go of is that these debates are in fact opposite or opposing contestations. And I think what we're looking at is a more complex understanding of a continuum of ideas, which might be implemented in one context in one way and implemented in another context in a different way. And so throughout this webinar series, this debate of this, what you're calling powerful and experiential and what others are calling sacred and profane, and this debate has been embedded in what we've been doing for the last 6 weeks and last 5 webinars. And so there has been this call for us to open up the space for us to have this debate. And perhaps one of the most powerful ideas, or one of the dead ideas that we can bring into that debate, is the sense that these are in fact such different ideas and that they do not and cannot exist on a continuum. And maybe the challenge, the reimagining, is to find a way for them to exist on a continuum in order that we can open up the space to not have this tension between kind of cognitive and on the one hand, and on the other hand, social justice, but where we can begin to merge some of these debates with each other. So I just wanted to say that before I open the floor. It's my job to read the comments at this point, and I really want to do that, but I have a big problem in that my screen doesn't tell me who made the comment. So I'm very sorry, because I like to say, you know, I see Kaya's put his name in. Thank you, Kaya. So it makes it a little difficult to identify who you are. But colleagues, we're a smaller group today because the students aren't with us today, and many of the lecturing staff from the colleges have also apologized because it's slap bang in the middle of exams. So maybe just put your hand up and expand on your point. Let me start right at the end and move my way up. We have Kaya. We have Steph. I agree with non-binary and continuum, but would love to have some discussion about concrete examples in terms of actual program offerings. That's from Steph. Thank you, Steph. It's a very, very important point that we need to be looking empirically, not just theoretically, at how these things are playing, how these aspects are playing out in practice. At Adam, great presentation. I would like to add that there's a history of education and training in and for the informal economy. The challenge, or most important question, relates to how young people seeking and working in the formal economy can be supported to achieve their aspirations and enjoy sustainable livelihoods. I don't know who has said that, which is unfortunate. So a powerful point there. Talking, I suspect, to adult education and the history of adult education in working in communities, but perhaps the person who wrote it can please jump in and speak. I also like the idea of talking about education as an ecosystem, TVET colleges, community and education centers, schools, universities, all addressing identified needs as an integrated education sector. That's Kaya talking systemically about the PSET sector and how we organize that sector coherently, raising obliquely the articulation issues. Somebody wants to be reminded of the topic today. Francis, maybe just type the topic into the chat, because I think the person's looking for the exact topic of Adam's presentation. We are coming back to institutional arrangements as last week and a purpose. At Adam, you touched on the notion of aspirations in passing. Could you elaborate more on what you see about youth aspirations, Adam? Very interesting question. Thanks for the presentation. I find what you say about it not having to be either or in the TVET space. It makes me think in terms of language, access, and how it doesn't have to be Indigenous or English, but finding a way to access, utilize both, while doing away with notions of standard languages in which students are taught and being assessed in TVET. Adam, would you like me to continue, or do you want to stop at this point? Can I do one more? What I took from the presentation is that unlocking youth capabilities might be a possibility. And then maybe I can stop, or shall I finish all the chat for you? Okay.
It's up to you. Go ahead.
Okay. Like the idea of meeting young people where they are, quality engagement, quality consultations, finding solutions with young people. That's from Kaya, and on the ground. And I suspect Kaya is emphasizing the importance of working with rather than on or at young people. Thank you, presenters, for an excellent presentation. Absolutely. Great session from Guy Harris, council member at False Bay College. My experience of the rural sector is that political and local government elites act as gatekeepers and dispense opportunities according to their own familial or political ambitions and needs. Okay, I'm going to stop there. If there's a point that I haven't read and that you'd like me to read, which you shared in the chat, please put your hand up. We're a smaller group, so we can at least, we've got 30 minutes to talk. So put your hand up and we can engage. Adam, I'm going to hand it back to you. And if anybody would like to contribute, I'm going to be looking for hands now. So please start putting your hands up while Adam responds. Adam?
Sure. I mean, I don't want to respond too much. I feel like I've been talking a lot, and I'd prefer if people have comments that they give them, and that I can let other people speak for a while. I mean, just to say a couple of things that come to mind, and this might not be helpful to people, particularly who focus on colleges, but one of the ideas to me around concrete proposals relates to how we organize space in urban context. And living in Cape Town, one of the most divided cities probably in the world, if you want to sell a cup of coffee on the pavement, on most pavements in Cape Town, that's not possible. Now, I'm not saying that people should be able to trade wherever they like, but I definitely think that we need to reimagine how space is used and who has the right to use it in what ways. So I think in terms of concrete proposals, that's a first step to thinking about how we organize some of these things. Yeah, I don't want to, there not being any hands, I don't want to go too much into the notion of aspirations that Simon asked about. I think reading Appadurai's The Capacity to Aspire would be his best bet. But, you know, and I think in having worked with young people in this country, I think that, you know, we've lived in a society that has taught people not to aspire, that taught people to stay at their station and to not imagine that they have the right to be in other places and other positions. And I think that this has been hugely damaging and traumatic as a society across the board to all of us. So I think in terms of aspirations, it's about also creating places where people feel that they have the right in a modest and without, you know, without leading to forms of violence, but that people feel that they can aspire to and that they can reach certain opportunities. I think that one thing that I have learned in working with young people is that people have, there's a deeply damaging sense of a society and how it's operated that continues here. And I think aspirations are about trying to change that in whatever role educational spaces might have. And that's why I like the idea about kind of bilingual approaches. I think language for me is a huge area where people are made to feel they don't belong in certain spaces. They're made to feel inferior. So that's one idea. Yeah, I don't see any other hands. So Leslie, I don't know if you want to comment some more or what.
I'd really like to hear from people. So I see Enver's hand is up, and if people are not putting up the hands, maybe we can encourage them by just kind of encouraging them. So maybe what we can do is, see Enver's hand is up. So Enver, I'm going to call on you next. I'm quite keen to hear from Colette as well, because I would like to hear a bit more of her work with plumbers. That would be interesting. I'd like Steph to maybe just unpack a little bit, Steph. Just maybe to unpack some of your thinking that you were sharing in the chat. Maybe Simon. So let me hear from Enver first. Let me hear from Yonita after Enver. And then I'm going to just suggest that some of the people who commented in the chat really share their thinking. Enver, you've got the floor.
Thanks very much, Leslie. Hello, everybody, and thanks to Adam. Actually, I came in because I heard so often, well, I don't see any hand, I don't see any hand. So I thought, well, let me put up my hand at least to help the discussion along. So if I may, unless you want others to speak first, Leslie, I'm quite happy to wait and then say something later if you think there are others who should be speaking.
Please go ahead, Enver, please do. You've
Okay,
got the
thanks.
floor.
Well, you know, I want to talk about how there's a very profound relationship between what's being spoken about in this seminar. And you know, the seminars, I don't know how many of the participants here are familiar with the seminars that have been taking place over the last 6 or 7 weeks, really organized by Sia and Irna at CIPSET. There's such a close relationship between what's certainly at a conceptual level, there's a very, very strong relationship. The focus is a bit different. And the focus there, which speaks to the stuff that Adam was speaking about, because there too, you know, the realization that human capital theory, formal labor markets, the policies and conferences and strategies and all of that unfolded by government over the last 20 years have really been quite unproductive and in fact have resulted in an even greater crisis in relation to what is possible for young people. But the focus in those seminars, having arrived at that starting point some while back, is to think about what is in the realm of the possible. And I think what those seminars are showing us around the concept, an important concept of socially useful work or socially useful labor, is that number one, we have to start taking seriously the actual learning processes that are taking place in communities, and even more strongly in social movements where communities have got together to develop social movements of various kinds around various issues. And this COVID has also shown how around health and other issues, such communities have come together around the production of food and also safety and health issues and so on and so forth. And so the main inquiry in relation to that kind of work is to try and understand what exactly are the processes of learning, how it takes place between actually academic institutions and communities. What are the key pedagogical principles which are beginning to be clarified by through the engagements between particularly universities and locally organized communities, how that might begin to constitute the foundations of a curriculum which could be taken forward in an organized and systematic way, how to systematize, in other words, the kinds of knowledge that is being developed and which communities are deeply involved in on a day-to-day basis. They are showing us, secondly, that all of these things are not related, are deeply embedded in practice, in actual doing of things, in socially useful work, and which has to do with, in many of the examples that we heard about, have to do with producing food, getting together, proto-cooperatives actually, forms of organization which are beginning to establish a set of principles around how to cooperate, how to share, how to act collectively, how to understand useful knowledge, how to use long years of experience, etc., etc. And the third thing they are beginning to explore, and in fact it's gone beyond exploration, to be honest, is the problem of the development of social and political consciousness as it arises as a consequence of practical and demonstrable activities on the ground through which learning is taking place. And so partly the last point is that the reliance on the state is very much a question, is no longer taken for granted. Not that the idea of mobilizing strongly so that to be able to put pressure on the state is ignored. On the contrary, but what it is very clear is that what is happening is the strengthening of organizational and community leverage on the ground. By the way, this is a phenomenon which is taking place globally. There are literally, I mean, a booklet we recently did on cooperatives is suggesting that, you know, the quantum of outputs in cooperatives globally from the data we found, but then that data is about 2 or 3 years old, you know, it should be by now be over $1 trillion. Now it's a small amount relative to the global capitalist economies, but there are more than 200 million people globally involved in one or other kind of alternative economic and livelihood activity, all of which have to do with knowledge production simultaneously. So I think there's a very profound relationship between what is being discussed and what those discussions were all about, and which are actually also built on many years of fairly detailed work. And Leslie, quite clearly, you know about all of that, but I thought I should share some of that with everybody. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Enver. Thanks for sharing that. Colleagues, there were 2 hands up earlier, and I recognized the 2 colleagues, and now I can't recall who you are. So please put your hands back up again so that I can recognize you again. In the meantime, I see Gareth Williams and Guy Harris, you noted. Let's go Gareth Williams first and then Guy Harris thereafter. And the other two colleagues, please do put your hands up again so I can recognize you again. Apologies for that. I got engrossed in the discussion that was taking place. Gareth, do you want to go first? Do you want to go first?
Hi, Leslie and colleagues. Thanks very much, and thanks to the presenters today. It's interesting sort of being in this space with you and sharing. And I think perhaps what I need to do is just very briefly just say where I find myself and sort of how I am positioned. So it would make sense then for the things that would sort of come from there. So I am a lecturer inside the music department, inside a university, basically where I had also studied. But at the same time, I find myself, and interesting, in what Adam is saying, that I have to sort of hold binaries as part of what I'm doing. And sometimes I feel it's more than binaries, actually, because I work in higher education with students who have aspirations, but at the same time, I also work on the ground with them. So number one, I am, let's say, a music lecturer and a teacher, but at the same time, I also work inside the music industry. And for a long time, I feel that universities do not actually understand the livelihoods of the people who come into their spaces. I don't know how else to put it. It's quite out of touch, actually, with how and where students have to work, etc. And I think, sort of, and the whole sort of legitimization of that. I think students come to us. So let's say if I first speak of sort of universities, etc., with their aspirations. And somehow you have this thing, I think, that happens and that I've seen, but colleagues won't acknowledge that there is not an understanding of that aspiration or even the world of where our students are coming from. These might be sort of gross generalizations now that I am making, but I sort of feel that and I, sort of see it. And I think for a long time, I have been finding that, itself, what is happening in South Africa and inside our communities is not really sort of well understood by higher education. And how one goes about that. And I suppose particularly music. I mean, one example that I can give is the way you access music industry, for example. You do not have to go through any formal qualifications, etc., etc. So I think for people, let's say, wanting to access or wanting to develop themselves in whichever kinds of economies, they need to engage with people who sort of understand those spaces or who are active inside them. I think I have many sort of ideas around this that possibly I will engage with you, Leslie, sort of after this and perhaps discuss. But I thought that's what I would like to share for now. Thanks very much.
Thanks so much, Gareth. Thank you so much. For those of us who've been participating in this journey, and many of us have come to the entire series, you would have heard a song being played at the beginning by Ulu, and Ulu Williams is the choir master who put that song together. So the video that you watched playing in the beginning of this is in fact Gareth's wife. So that's not his call to fame. He's a good musician in his own right. And I think thanks, Gareth, for emphasizing the importance of being aware of the real lives being lived in our communities. But I thought it's a nice moment just to thank Ula for the music that we've been using, and maybe you can share that with her when you see her again in the next few hours. And Enver, thank you so much for flagging the difference between knowing as an individual asset and knowing as a communal asset, and knowing that works towards building a surplus labor force and knowing that works towards building resistance to forms of oppression in our society. So I think these are two important aspects that you've also raised. We have Guy Harris next, and I need to please ask the colleagues who had their hand up, who I noted earlier and who I forgot while listening to Enver, please put your hands up again so I can note you. Guy, you've got the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, and well done to NMU for the series. I found it very useful. I'm very pleased to hear that there's going to be a document put together and hopefully some action plans and and strategies. It doesn't just stay at the policy and strategy level. It gets actually down to the implementation. I'm very passionate about TVET entrepreneurship. I believe that it's those soft skills, the hard trades, what I call the oil industries, the hair oil, the cooking oil, the machine oil, and the body oil, that is going to create a lot of jobs. None of them might be solopreneurs, but there's nothing wrong with that, because that's really important in terms of poverty alleviation. I was absolutely horrified, and I apologize if there are any DHET people on this webinar, when DHET announced entrepreneurship and then said it was only for universities. It just entrenched the chasm between universities and TVET colleges, and I won't even start talking about community colleges. I think there's a huge amount that we need to do as society. Put some items in the chat box. I'm not going to repeat them here, but hopefully in 2021, South Africa and TVETs will pivot. Just an example that what happened with TVET devices was an absolute travesty of justice, and it just proved that conformance trumps performance. And I think it's up to us as people who are involved in TVETs or civil society to agitate and to make our voice heard. The only people who are worse, dealt with worse, because they don't have a voice at all, is early childhood development beneficiaries. The fact that the ECD schools were shut down during lockdown was tragic. The fact that it's a sad indictment that many TVET colleges students depend on the college for at least one nutritious meal a day, and the lack of nutritious food security in South Africa at a local level. These are all issues, but I'm starting to ramble and starting to develop a laundry list, for which I apologize. I'm very happy to engage with people. Thanks, Leslie.
Thanks, Guy. Thank you so much. Because others haven't put their hand up, I'm going to take the initiative from the floor. And I see that Randa Hilal has joined us. She's just sent me a message apologizing for being late. And Randa, it would be really nice to hear a bit from your experience of TVET in Palestine and your experience of gender. And I think your work on gender is very important to bring into this dialogue, because it's kind of disappeared from the debate a little bit. Oh, and I see Annette's hand is up too. Let's hear Randa, and then Annette we can note it after Randa. Randa?
Oh, yes, I was muted and talking. Okay, thank you, Leslie, for inviting me in. I'm happy to join you, and I joined also last week, and I think that the issue of TVET and the marginalized in general is a very important issue. The issue of TVET and gender has its own dimensions, as of course TVET in Palestine is rooted in the social work of some of the social institutes and the church-related organization who started maybe in the middle of the 18th century, but it has grown up to be provided by the government. Of course, our government is only started in 1994 at the PA after the Oslo Agreement. So they took responsibility of TVET. So each TVET branch has got its own history in a way, but at the end, we have a joint TVET in its TVET education, TVET training, and technical education as well. Now, gender has been an issue where women in Palestine has shown a high interest in education, and also, but at the end, their entrance to the labor market has been low. And this is maybe also is a case in the in the Arab world and the MENA region in general. But in Palestine, the TVET has been a way towards two things. First of all, help them in gender equality, in having the route towards employment if they want, and also having the route towards achieving their own personal aspirations. In my study, it has shown that through VET and through work afterwards, it has been
Okay, I think we've just lost Randa. Randa,
okay,
we've
very
just
quickly. Social empowerment, yes, and it has helped them in making decisions in the family and in other places. So it has been an important route for females as well as males in that regard. Thank you. Thank you, Leslie.
Thanks so much, Randa. Annette, and then after Annette, Kaya. Thanks so much, Randa. Annette?
Hi, my name's Annette Loebscher. I used to be a training provider in arts and culture in the rural areas in the Eastern Cape. And, oh, sorry, my video. Sorry. There we go. Oopsie. There we go. There we go. Thanks. So basically, I just wanted to say that my experience has been that the legacy of apartheid has been quite intense, but there are, entrepreneurship is actually, for me, I found that people had lots of ideas, but entrepreneurship was something that almost people had to feel that they were safe. They had to belong. I like the idea of this communities of trust from the last webinar. I think it's terribly important that this whole idea of working with the formal structures and the informal from the ground up, I think it's very important, that aspect. But one has to be able to also facilitate this idea of communities of trust, so that in actual fact, what people are busy asking for or needing is authentic. And very often it's also linked to their histories. They might have been the area where I was working, if they weren't farm laborers, they were actually linked to the wood production industry in Knysna. And in actual fact, that was something which actually only came out, it was historical. So history and this communities of trust is actually quite important. And I endorse this idea of where civic structures or social groups work together, because somehow that is where people feel safer and can start what's the word? Start lobbying for working towards an entrepreneurial self-employment model. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Annette. Kaya, you noted? Kaya? Mr. Matiso, where are you? Your hand was up, you noted?
That's a very good input. What you're doing, you're reminding us about what you have done in the past. You're asking questions about what you've done. You're also asking questions about what you are doing currently. At the same time, you are reminding us about the needs of young people. And that's what needs to be done in South Africa. So the point I'm making is the big challenge of doing something about marginalized community, unemployed young people. Some of them are very poor, extremely poor. And I think all of us are trying to say, dealing with this question from different perspectives. In dealing with this question of the social needs of young people, Perhaps there are some dimensions that I would like to raise, maybe 3 of them, that I personally like to discuss. The first one is, how do we assess the needs of these young people who are unemployed and poor? How do you assess their needs? Do you know their needs? Or you just talk about them? Have you ever met them? Do you go to the villages? Do you go to the farms? Do you go to the township? Do you know their needs? I think that's a very important question. I think this discussion is reminding us about that. There's educators, there's researchers, there's principals of colleges, there's universities, and so on. It's reminding about that basic pertinent question, the needs of these young people. But secondly, the discussion is also reminding me about whether we know where these young people are. Do you know where these young people are? And then thirdly, very important, what are they doing? What are they doing there? You know, if you say they are poor, they are marginalized, they're unemployed, what are they doing in order to survive? They're doing something, in my view, in my experience. There's something that they're doing in order to survive. And perhaps the last question is, how do we support them? I've got 2 specific examples, for example, that I think perhaps is part of the trend in South Africa. One of them is the emerging housing systems in rural areas. I don't know whether we monitor this. You also monitor what these young people are doing in those housing projects. Because rural areas these days, you know, they've been changed. They are changing. And you find these young people talking about plumbing. They've never been trained as plumbers. You'll find them talking about being electricians. They've never been trained, but they can see the needs because of the emerging housing trends in rural areas, for example. If you drive along N2 on the eastern side of the Eastern Cape, you'll find those houses. If you drive from King Williamstown towards Forte University, you'll find those emerging rural areas. And young people are there. They can see the trend. They're interested to participate in those projects. I'm raising this because there's a role there for TVET colleges. There's a role there for community learning centers. Maybe another example is food security, a very important issue from a development perspective. The emerging food gardens in rural areas, what the young people are doing there. Where are our agricultural colleges? Are they aware of those trends? Where are our TVET colleges, especially those that are offering agriculture? Are they aware of those trends? We talk general about food security. Practical on the ground, we'll find food gardens. In my view, when I'm talking about going to where they are, when I talk about townships and villages, I'm talking about finding out all those, I call them basic initiatives. They are not imposed on people. They are from the people, the communities themselves. Our role as institutions, as schools, as colleges and universities is to go do what I call quality consultation, quality engagement, and perhaps in that process, you'll find solutions. In my view, permanent solutions, because you know exactly what's happening on the ground. You have done your quality consultation, and then you bring the institutions to those villages, to those townships. That's my contribution, Chair. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Matiso. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand to Adam now to just pull everything together, and then we can close because it's 1:30 already. Just to say thanks, Randa, for really emphasizing the role of TVET in spaces of extreme inequality and the role of TVET in working with the most marginalized in those spaces, and in this case, Palestinian women, and Kaya for really raising the context and the situatedness, if you like, of the understandings from which we make policy and practice. You know, I think it's a very powerful message that you're giving us, and as a principal who's worked with these young people, it's a message that can't really be ignored. I'd like to hand over to Adam now. Adam, can I hand the floor over to you just to comment and to pull together and so on, and then we can close the session? Or is that all right with you? I know you didn't want to talk anymore, but I'd really like us to hear from you again.
Sure. Thank you, Leslie. Just one or two comments, and thank you all for so many responses that were all really useful. And yeah, I really appreciated the sort of, I think that this community of people that's been engaging in this set of webinars are located in very different positions in all of this. So I think as a partial response to Kaya, that it's really important that these different places that people are located in are able to engage with each other. And I think that speaks to a kind of idea of you know, my institution speaking a lot about socially engaged scholarship, or what it means to as researchers to engage, and for how we bring that into the work that we do. I was really glad that Enver spoke about co-ops, which is something that's really been interesting me lately. I read Kate Phillip, who's now apparently in the presidency, wrote a book which was actually the original title of this presentation, called Markets on the Margins, and is about co-ops in South Africa. That did come out of the sort of union movement and the co-ops that were invested in there. But I think that it's a fascinating area of in terms of proposals and policies of how co-ops might be one way of creating collective ownership of various initiatives, particularly around sharing expenses around equipment and so on. I mean, I don't think it's reading Kate Phillip's book, I don't think it's in any way easy to get a co-op going and make it successful, but I think that it is one sort of initiative that we could be thinking about going forward, particularly because it's already, as Enver says, sort of happening informally on the ground. And again, that's what I've sort of tried to allude to in this presentation is how to support what's already happening, as opposed to ideas that might resonate with those of us who are not in the context that we're writing about. I'm also glad that Leslie mentioned gender, because I think it's an extremely, you know, all of the things that I spoke about today, when you look at them through a gendered lens, have hugely different repercussions for what we're talking about, and the ways that that these forms of livelihoods work and operate through gender. So I think it's definitely something to keep in mind. Yeah, I'll stop there and hand over to Leslie to say goodbye, but also just wanted to say thank you to everyone for giving me this opportunity to speak in a community that I haven't had a lot of experience or contact with in the past, but hope to going forward.
Thank you so much, Adam. And just to say from all of us, really thank you so much for your fantastic presentation. It's pushed us, it's pushed our thinking. And I think you ended off with a question, which is how do we support what's already happening? And I think for the TVET sector, the question then becomes, how does TVET better support what's already happening? And I think it's a question that hasn't been phrased in that way. And I think it's a beautiful framing of the question. So thank you, Adam. And please do thank Azim from us. I mean, we didn't thank him sufficiently before we knew he was rushing off. Colleagues, thanks a lot for participating. The next session, we have our international colleagues here, and they are going to be sharing international experiences. And Simon, dear Simon, has the unenviable task of trying to, in 5 or 7 or some ridiculously short time period, he has the unenviable task of trying to pull and wrap the webinar series and the debates that have emerged together and to suggest thematically anyways a way forward for us as a community. As I said, the working group will meet in January and we will talk through how we want to take this forward, bearing in mind that we also don't want to kill people with webinars. It's got to be a bit of a balance. And so just thank you very much, everybody. We'll see you on the 10th of December, I think is the next webinar at the International Perspectives webinar. All right, bye, 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 bye. Can people put their videos on so at least we can see you, because some of us haven't seen each other for a long time and it's nice to at least see you on the webinar for a few minutes. So Jocelyn, your video is offered to be lovely just to see you for a bit and wave goodbye to you. And you just want to pop videos on so we can just do a quick goodbye wave to colleagues, to Letu, Sister Letu's there. Bye-bye to Letu.
Bye.
Joy.
Bye, Leslie.
Bye all.
Bye. Thanks so much, everyone.
Bye. Bye.
All right. Closing the meeting now.
Thanks, Adam.
And for the impulse.